Today's daf we're going to be learning is Avodah Zarah Daf Tet. Today's daf is sponsored by Razi Jaffe in honor of the 12th year side of her father, Mickey Mulrad, Moshe Yaakov, and David Halav Shalom. My father was devoted first and foremost to his family, supportive and generous to a fault. He humbly practiced V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha all of his life. Today's daf is sponsored by Gita and David Neufeld in loving memory of their dear friend and mentor, Harleen Appelman, Chaya Bat Shmuel V'osna Rachel Aleh Shalom, fierce champion of Jewish education, tradition, and identity. Harleen's voice and wisdom continue to whisper in our ears. Siftei Ishanim Dovivot. We're going to start today with Rish Lakish. We have a situation. Okay, we started a bunch of situations like this where a rabbi comes to town. We're going to see more today and sees people doing things that he's not really so happy with. So we have Rabbi Yirmiyah, and that's how we got to these stories because we were talking about mizigah, pouring water into wine to dilute it. Is that a problem if an Oved Kochavim does it, even though they're not actually touching the wine, they're just pouring water into the wine? And we said best to avoid it because of this lech lechamrina lazira. Tell a Nazir, don't go anywhere near a vineyard, right? Keep yourselves a classic, right, approach of the rabbis. Keep far away from things that might cause you to sin. So keep the idol worshiper away from your wine. Don't allow this way, otherwise we'll end up allowing other ways. Then we had the story of Rish Lakish who comes to Batsra, and he thought that Batsra was part of Israel because he thought it was the city called Betzer. Okay, these are, by the way, on the Transjordan area. He thought it was Betzer, and Rabbi Yochanan says it was Batsra, right? So Rish Lakish comes to town. He sees a Jew not eating untithed produce, and he sees people drinking water that idols have worshipped. And he says these are both forbidden, stops them from doing it, comes into Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, before you even take your jacket off, quickly go back, tell them you made a mistake. Betzer is not Batsra, okay? Batsra is not Betzer, basically, and it wasn't Israel proper. And public waters are not forbidden. And we saw that Rabbi Yochanan, that's his approach. He says in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yehotzadok, Maim shel Rabim ein esarim. That's the top of our daf. Rabbi Yochanan is consistent with his opinion that public waters are not forbidden. So now the Gemara makes some assumption from that. Wait, it sounds like only because of public waters, but hadi yachid nesarim. If it was someone's individual water, private water, that somebody worshipped, it would be forbidden. Don't we say that the water that someone bows down to, okay, let's say it's their own water, okay, forget someone else's, can't really be someone else's, but if it was privately owned water and the owner bowed down to it, wouldn't be forbidden because it's attached to the ground, like the mountains that we've seen before. So he answers, gala. We must be talking about water that a wave came, swept the water away, and it's now no longer attached to the ground. It sweeps it away into some sort of vessel. The idol worshiper worships it, and now it's forbidden. And that is, again, the inference. Because this was public waters, it was a problem. Had it been private, it wouldn't have been a problem because it was water that was swept away by the ocean and it was privately owned. So they say, wait, this is, if you would assume this, we're going to have a problem because it's no different than Avnei Har Shenidal Delunin. These are like rocks that fall from a mountain. Remember that? We said if they fall on their own, just like this water that got swept away by a wave and is now detached from the ground. And we had a machloket there between Rabbi Yochanan and the Bnei Rabbi Chia. And we didn't know who said what. Well, if this is Rabbi Yochanan's position that we can infer from this case, then it should be very clear to time to Rabbi Yochanan Damar Sulat, because had it been privately owned, it would have been forbidden. So the Gemara has to change their answer and answer a little differently. It wasn't that the wave swept it away and it was no longer attached to the ground, because that wouldn't help, because again, maybe it would, but then it would be clear which position Rabbi Yochanan held in that debate. And it wasn't clear in the sugya when we had that. Lo tzricha ditabchinu b'yadei. Must be that the person who worshiped the water took the water out of, let's say, the ocean or wherever it was, in a sea or in a river, took the water out, put it into something else. It's privately owned water. It was taken out by the person, and then it's not like Avnei Har Shenidal Delu that fell on their own. Somebody actually took them out. Now they're no longer attached, and they're privately owned, and that's why it would be forbidden. But if they were publicly owned that had been taken out in this way, they would actually be permitted because you can't forbid publicly owned water. And that's where Rabbi Yochanan was critical of Rish Lakish. Now we get to another story where a rabbi comes to town and sees people doing things potentially that are wrong, but we're going to see there's a bit of a digression here from the theme we've been seeing. Rabbi Chiya bar Abba ikla legavla. Rabbi Chiya bar Abba gets to the city of Gavla. Chaz, we're going to see later that Gavla were not people who were what we call b'nei Torah. Okay, most of them were not halacha, careful about halacha. Chaz b'nai Yisrael, he sees three things. He sees b'nai Yisrael demi Abra me'avdei kochavim shemala v'lo tavlu. He sees Jewish girls who were getting pregnant from idol worshippers who did a Brit Milah. They started the conversion process. They were circumcised, but they didn't go to the mikveh. So they technically weren't Jews. He saw water. Now we go back to the previous sugya. He saw wine, that the idol worshippers were pouring water into to dilute the wine. And the Jews were drinking it. Chazet Tormasa, he found lupines, dishalkelu of de kochavim, that the Gentiles were cooking the achle Yisrael, and the Jews were eating it and weren't worried about bishul akum, about food cooked by Gentiles. V'lo amar lehu v'lo midi. Now, in this case, different from the other two cases, he sees these people doing things. Presumably, he wasn't so thrilled with it, but he doesn't say anything. Until the Kamed Rabbi Yochanan. Now, it goes before Rabbi Yochanan. I want to remind you, in the previous story, Rish Lakish screams at the people, says, stop what you're doing. Rabbi Yochanan gets angry with him and says, you were stopping them from doing something that technically they were permitted to do. In this story, it's going to be the opposite. This rabbi, Rabbi Chiya bar Abba, sees people doing things and doesn't say anything. And when he comes before Rabbi Yochanan and tells him, go out and announce, make it public, that all those children born to those marriages or relationships between the Jewish girls and the Gentile men are mamzerim. We're going to have to see why he says this, because we generally don't say that a Jew born from a Gentile is a mamzer. V'al yenam mishum yenesech, and their wine, that's yenesech. And al tormsam mishum b'shulei avdei kochavim, and on their lupines, because of bishul akum, mishum she'enam b'nei Torah, because they're not b'nei Torah. Now we're going to see later that because they're not b'nei Torah is only on the lupines. Okay, the rest of them are actually forbidden. And the last one is only because they're not b'nei Torah, we're going to be stricter with them. So let's read and understand each of these things. Al b'neim shem mamzerim. Well, Rabbi Yochanan l'tameh actually fits perfectly with Rabbi Yochanan's approach, because even though I said that generally we don't hold that way, Rabbi Yochanan does think that children born to Gentile fathers are mamzerim. Rabbi Yochanan said, you're not a ger until you complete the process, doing a Brit Milah and not go into the mikveh. You're not a full convert. And since he didn't go to the mikveh, he's an ovei kochavim. So that's number one. We have to say this is an idol worshiping person. They're not considered Jews. They haven't fully converted. Another statement that Rabbi Yochanan is quoted as having said, Ovei kochavim ve'eved haba ba'Yisrael. If you have either an ovei kochavim, a Gentile, or a slave, a Canaanite slave, haba ba'Yisrael, that engages in relations with a Jewish girl, Jewish woman, havlad mamzer. The child is a mamzer. And that's a unique opinion, but it's Rabbi Yochanan's opinion. So it fits perfectly. Rabbi Yochanan said, this is a problem. Their children are mamzer. Ugzor yena mishum yenesech, mishum lech amrinu nazira, schor lekamelok tekrav. And the wine, just like we said in the previous stuff, which is you have to keep away from this. If we allow the Gentiles to dilute our wine, we'll allow the Gentiles to pour our wine, to touch our wine, to, all these issues, and therefore keep away from it. So now we have to deal with this line. There are lupines because of bishul akum, because they're not b'nei Torah. So now they ask, Taman de'em nam b'nei Torah, ha b'nei Torah sharu. But wait, if they were b'nei Torah, it would be permitted. When don't we have a problem of cooked foods? Remember, we learned this back when we learned about bishul akum, if it can be eaten raw. Lupines can't be eaten raw, so it should be a problem to everybody, not just people who aren't b'nei Torah. Well, Rabbi Yochanan kiach lishna, he holds by the other language. If you remember, there were two versions of what he said. If it's not something that go on the table of kings to eat with their bread, it's not typical to bring this on the table of the kings, then there's no bishul akum. And lupines are not things that people eat at the king's table. And therefore, Tama de'enam b'nei Torah, ha b'nei Torah. Shale. To most people, actually, lupans are permitted. But to people who aren't B'nai Torah, we should forbid them because if we let them eat that, they'll come to eat other things. They won't know to make these distinctions. We're always worried about people that are not B'nai Torah. They won't understand the fine tunings. They won't understand why this is permitted and other things aren't, and then they'll go to permit many more things. So we have to be more strict with them. So again, we have a story where in this case, the rabbi didn't reprimand them, and Rabbi Yochanan was all upset and said, go out and announce to them and tell them, stop them from what they're doing. So it wasn't that Rabbi Yochanan didn't like stopping people. It was in each case, Rabbi Yochanan thought the rabbi was making a mistake. It's also interesting, by the way, each rabbi comes into the Beit Midrash, sees Rabbi Yochanan, tells him what transpired, and then, obviously Rabbi Yochanan has a comment. Rav Kahana. They asked Rav Kahana the following question: Ovei kochavim ma'u shiulich anavim lagat. Can the Ovei kochavim transport the grapes from the vineyard to the wine press? So the question is, what's the problem? Okay, we're going to see the answer, which is Amar lehu asul mishum lech lech amrin nazira schor schor lekamar lo tikra. Again, better to avoid. Don't let the Gentile get involved in this part of the process, because if we let him get involved in that part of the process, then the idol worshiper might come to actually tread on the grapes, might come to touch the wine. And later, remember, we had the whole difference of opinion about whether treading the grapes is a problem or not, but they might touch it, right? It just leads to problems. Now, the question is, what's exactly the question and what's exactly the answer? So there's a huge debate among the commentaries. If you look in Tosfot, at the very, very bottom of our daf, he quotes Ma'u Chanavim Lagat Rashbam Peresh V'zel Shano. He quotes the Rashbam. When you put the grapes into a basket to bring them to the God. On the next page now, mitma'atim v'nichbashima anavim zalse. Okay, mitma'achim. Sorry, they start getting crushed one on the other. V'ayayim mizalef, and the wine starts spurting out. Umitilino tambagad, and then they throw them into the God. So the question is, according to the Rashbam, can he bring them to the God while the water is coming, the juice is dripping out? Are we worried that when he touches the liquid, he can turn it into yen nesach? Now, Tosfot has a big problem with this, brings a whole slew of questions, brings a different, okay, if you look in my Gemara, it's where the wides start getting a little wider. I don't know if it's in everyone's, but it says the explains that it's actually once the wine starts pouring out, in other words, here in the Rashbam was concerned, even if the water liquid hasn't come out, do we have to be worried that it might come out and then he'll come to do it? He says it's obviously the water is already coming out, otherwise for sure it's not a problem. And he starts saying, right, the question is really, is it like Mizagove Kochavim when he puts it in the gut? Is there a concern? Maybe he'll touch it. Is there a concern? He has a whole bunch of other questions about what exactly the issue is. So it's not 100% clear what the concern is, but either which way we see it, the Gemara thinks that this is a concern, right? Rav Kahana basically says it's forbidden because it should just be avoided. Not like there's any real halachic problem, but if we start allowing that, we'll allow other things, and then the Gentile will come to actually offer wine as a libation down the road. A to be Rav Yerma, the Rav Kahana, but Rav Yerma comes and asks the difficulty on Rav Kahana from the following source. Tanaitic source. A Gentile who brings grapes to the God in baskets. So first of all, you see here, they did this. Ubidoldirin, okay, in other little barrels. Even though the wine is squirting out, it's still permitted. So that looks like exactly our case, and it says it's permitted. To which Rav Kahana answers, he says, you're questioning me from a totally different situation. That was a case where it said, if the Ovei Kochavim brought it already, which we call b'di'evet, it's already too late, they've already been brought, we don't have to worry about it. But you asked me, can we hire a person to do it? That I will tell you to avoid. If it's already done, okay, it's done. Right? And in general, we make these safeguards around. We don't always forbid it once it's already done. It's just we forbid it in advance so that you don't come to make any other mistakes. Now we have a case that happened. It's kind of funny situation. In Etrog, Dinafa lechavita dechamar fell into a barrel of wine. Idre ovei kochavim v'shakle. Ovei kochavim, we're going to see two cases like this today, jumps in, like really to help. Okay, he wanted to get the etrog so it wouldn't be doused in the wine. And he picks it up. Now, what's the problem? He put his hand right into the top of the barrel. Amar lahu Rav Ashi niktu aliyade. Now, he didn't yet, remember, to do yeh nesach, you have to do the shichshuch. The shichshuch is some, making some motion in the water, which is what they would do to offer the libation. So he hasn't yet done it. He just put his hand onto the etrog to grab the etrog. So, Amar lu Rav Ashi said, niktu aliyade, hold his hand in place so it doesn't do shichshuch. It doesn't move his hand around. So hold it still. While it's holding still, while it's like on the etrog at the top of the barrel of the wine, uvartzua ad shayafa, and then tilt the barrel, start dumping out the wine until the level of wine gets below the level of his hand, and then let go of his hand and he'll take his hand out. Now, the whole thing is that we don't even want him taking his hand out while his hand is still touching the wine, because then as he's taking his hand out, he could do the shichshuch. So hold his hand straight so it doesn't move, tilt the barrel so that by the time you put the barrel back, his hand will no longer be touching the wine. And when he takes it out, he's just taking it out of the air and he won't touch the wine at all. And that was his solution. Amar Rav Ashi continues now and says, we have an Ovei Kochavim who specifically offered up a libation from the wine of a Jew with intent. Okay, you might remember that we learned you can't really forbid other people's stuff, but you can, like not by bowing, like we saw before with the water. Right? That wouldn't, if it belonged to someone else, you wouldn't be able to forbid someone water just by bowing. But if you actually do an action to it, and nisuch is considered an action by moving your hands around in there, then you could. So here we say, if you're menasech lechamer disrael b'chavana, afagav lezibun elovei kochavim acharina asul. Now the Jew can't sell it to any other Gentile. However, so in other words, again, it's not forbidden. So you could, it's forbidden. They can be menasech your wine, and therefore it would be forbidden to you, and you can't sell it to anybody because you can't benefit at all. However, what they did permit is very interesting. Heter, you can actually take money, which is really like damages from the idol worshiper who did this to your wine. So if somebody comes and messes up your wine, you can say to them, give me the value because you basically ruined my wine. And then the chiddush is you can give them the barrel, meaning it's kind of like a sale because in the end, they're giving you the money for the barrel and you're giving them the wine. But because my taima mikla kalya, it's because he really burnt it for you. He really destroyed this wine for you. So it's really more like he's paying you damages and then you can give him the wine also. So it's kind of a sale because you get the money for the value of, what it was. So it was worth $100. You get $100 from them. You give them the wine, but it's not really viewed as a sale. You can't sell it to any other non-Jew. But the non-Jew idol worshiper who did it to you, you can take money from them because they're really just paying you damages. And you can give them the wine. Okay, because what are you going to do with it anyway? Amar Rav Ashi, Now Rav Ashi says, where do I get this from? Right? It's pretty big chiddush. It says Ditanya. Well, there's actually a big machloket. Now we don't hold by the two opinions by the two rabbis that we see, Rabbi Yehuda ben Patera and Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. But he's going to use them as a way to, right? Sometimes we don't always hold by opinions, but what they say has validity. And on that basis, we're going to permit this. So let's read. Right? What we have here is a case where there was no idol there. So if a Gentile offers up libations of the Jews' stuff, of the Jews' wine, in a place where there is no idol, asul. Tanakama says it's forbidden. However, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava and Rabbi Yehuda ben Patera mitirim mishum shnei dvarim. They give two reasons to permit this. Echad, she'em menaschim yain ela b'fnei avodah zarah. One is we don't offer libations. The Gentiles, the idol worshippers, don't offer libations before avodah zarah. If it's not before avodah zarah. In other words, we don't assume there was any libation done unless there's an idol there, which we don't paskin like because we forbid yeh nesach anywhere, even if there are no idols. But they claim that it's not done generally. Ve'echad, and the other one is she'omer lo kol imenach shetasur yini lo and see. How could you forcibly forbid my wine? Now we did talk about before that they can, but it's a little bit right. It seems unfair. On what basis can you forbid my wine? So on the basis of what they say, we're going to say, number one, there was no idol here. Number two, the idol worshiper really has no right to come and ruin my stuff. And on the basis of those two things, even though we don't hold like them, we do allow, Rav Ashi says, we allow this solution of make the idol worshiper pay the damages, and then you can give them the wine. Okay, we're going to start this today. Now, this is our last thing for today. We have a barrel of wine, was the case, that the spout broke off and the wine is dripping out. So again, we have this Gentile who comes to the rescue, thinking he's helping. So he quickly jumps and he puts his hand right by the spout to catch the wine that's coming out. Amar of Papa called asir v'idach shari. Anything that's near the spout that's coming out is forbidden. Why is that? Rashi says, first of all, asur b'shtiya, only forbidden to drink. V'lo b'hanai, permits it to benefit from. Sharei ein kan shichshuch. Why? Because they can't really do shichshuch, because the nekev is tsar ve'eno echol shachshech. Coming out it's a very narrow opening. It's not possible, right? When you put your hand into a barrel, you can do the shichshuch. But when it's coming out like that, you can't really do shichshuch in that. So we're going to be strict and not allow you to drink it because in the end, the Gentile touched it. But we're not going to be that strict that we're going to forbid it to benefit from because there's no way there was shichshuch done. And the rest of it is permitted, and Rashi points out here, to kasavard stadin lav chibor leaser kol hayayin. Right? Things on the side of it or above it, right, where it's coming out of, since he didn't touch that at all and it didn't yet reach his hand until after, we're not going to view that as problematic. Okay, so let's go back and let's see what we did today. We started with this statement, this thing that Rabbi Yochanan was upset at Rish Lakish for his psakim and told him to go back and told him they were wrong. Then we just had to deal with this inference of the water. Why do you have to say the water belonged to the public? Even if it was private, it shouldn't be. It's mechubarim. We had to come up with a case where it was not mechubar, and yet it was also owned by a private individual and was also taken out by a private individual. Otherwise, we would have understood very clearly, which we didn't understand clearly, who holds what in the debate of the Avnei Harsh and Idaldalu. Then we had the case of Rabbi Chiya who comes to Gavla, and there were three things he sees, one of them being connected to our topic of the Gentile diluting the wine. And he doesn't stop anybody from doing anything, but comes Rabbi Yochanan and says, you're wrong in all three counts. The kids are mamzerim. The wine is problematic because better to avoid it because of the, like in the Nazir. And the Tormasim are forbidden specifically because they're not B'nai Torah. Normally would be permitted because Rabbi Yochanan held the one who says has to be on the table of kings. And this isn't something that goes on the table of kings, but because they were not B'nai Torah, he wanted to be strict with them. Then we had the question they asked Rav Kahana about can you have an idol worshiper take your grapes to the wine press, which we said you can't do it lechatchila, right? Then we had this difficulty, right? You can't do it. And then you said, what about this other place where it seems like they can? Well, that's b'diavad, but that already happened. Then fine, it's not really a problem, but you should avoid it. Because again, lech amrin l'nazira, right? If we allow that, then we're worried about other things that you might allow other things. We had the case of the etrog that fell in and they tilted it and held his hand so that he wouldn't do the shichshuch. And then we had the case of he did it to someone else, right? He did the nisuk to someone else without kavanah. And we said we're going to allow the Jew to actually sort of sell it back to that person, make them pay damages, and then give them the wine. And this is allowed because even though we don't hold it for Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera and Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, we can at least use it as what we call a snif lahakel. It gives us a way to permit something that we wouldn't have permitted otherwise. And then we ended with the case of the spout opening and the Gentile jumping in to help us, but didn't really help us because he then forbade the wine coming out of there, but only for drinking, not for benefit. And the rest of the wine in the barrel was not forbidden. That's it for today. Wishing everyone a good day and a Shavua Tov. I forgot to mention this is the Daf for Shabbat.